The Everglades are wild and isolated, and full of deadly dangers. Not intended for humans to dominate, those who call this marshy land their home must have an affinity for nature or a severe need to keep away from civilization. Full of drink and with fists clenched is how Edgar J. Watson approached the world. Well into his 40s, Edgar maintained a rougher kind of life. By 1889, he'd been accused of at least 4 murders, traveled to Oklahoma Territory, gotten mixed up with some outlaws, killed their female leader, and returned to Florida to face another murder charge. It is not clear what the outcome of those charges were, but Edgar never served any jail time. In 1891, he killed a man in Arcadia in self-defense, and this led him to move further south to Chatham Bend, near Chokoloskee, Florida. Chokoloskee is a small island in the 10,000 Islands area of Florida that has been occupied by various groups over the centuries, for indigenous ceremonies, for farming, and military operations. In the late 1800s, it was a known refuge for criminals, and Edgar Watson fit right in. He purchased land, built a house, started a farm, and sold his crops in the nearby towns of Fort Myers and Key West. He eventually had to find help from the mainland to manage his sugarcane operation and amassed a small fortune. That fortune didn't trickle down to his employees, however. It is claimed by those who worked for Edgar that he was killing off his employees instead of paying them, and dumping their bodies into the waterways of the 10,000 Islands. These claims could never be corroborated, even when human remains were found on his property. He said they were bones from when the indigenous people held ceremonies on the island. There had been a number of remains discovered throughout the 10,000 Islands, so he was never charged with any crimes against his employees. But they continued to disappear, and people remained suspicious of Edgar. While living near Chokoloskee, he kept mostly to himself, but his drinking and temper got him into a few scrapes with the locals. Adolphus Santini, a landowner on Chokoloskee, and Edgar once got into a scuffle in Key West. Edgar drew a knife, and Santini's throat was cut. Somehow he survived the attack, and Edgar was going to be charged for attempted murder. However, Edgar never went to jail or trial. Rumor is he paid Santini $900 to make it all go away. Another time he discovered 2 men squatting on his land, and they were found dead shortly after refusing to leave the property. Again, no charges were pressed, and Edgar claimed ignorance to what caused their death. It seemed Edgar Watson would be able to get away with all these murders and more, but the tipping point came in 1910 when 2 men and a woman came to Chokoloskee looking for work. They became popular with the locals during their time on the island, so it was a big deal when they were later found dead on Edgar Watson's land. He'd hired them to work in his sugarcane fields, and the townspeople accused him of murder. He claimed he was innocent, but knew who committed the crime: his foreman, Leslie Cox. To prove his innocence, Edgar asked the sheriff in Fort Myers to investigate. Because of a storm brewing, the sheriff could not make it to Chatham Bend. This angered the townspeople, who assumed that was another excuse for Edgar to get away with another murder. A powerful hurricane spun across South Florida, flooding much of Chokoloskee Island. As the town recovered from the storm, Edgar continued trying to clear his name. He made it known he was going to hunt down Leslie Cox and bring him back to be tried, or, quote, bring back his head. He geared up at the Chokoloskee local store, where he was purposely sold ammunition that had been submerged in the flooding. The townsfolk, more concerned with their survival than catching a supposed murderer, let him leave. While he was gone, another body was found, and that was the last straw. On October 24th, 1910, a crowd gathered in town to discuss what to do about Edgar Watson. As timing would have it, Edgar returned to town during this gathering. He had a story ready to tell about how he found and shot Leslie Cox, and held up a bullet-hole-riddled hat as proof that he did away with the murderer. The storekeeper said he couldn't possibly have shot Leslie Cox. She'd sold him wet ammunition. This took everyone by surprise. Edgar raised his shotgun and pulled the trigger, but the shopkeeper was right, and his water-damaged ammunition did not fire. He threw it down and reached for his revolver, but there wasn't enough time. Shots fired from the guns of the townspeople who'd had enough of Edgar's killing spree. When they finished, they tied Edgar's body to a boat, towed him to a different island, buried him there, then contacted the sheriff to inform him of the situation. The sheriff eventually came around to exhume Edgar Watson's body and found it to have 33 bullet wounds, but no one was ever charged with the crime. More than 200 years have passed since Edgar Watson's death, yet his legacy lives on. Some who have studied all the evidence claim Edgar was not guilty of the 3 murders in 1910. Edgar, who'd been charged with murder many times before, had never so strongly proclaimed his innocence. Could he have been framed? Or did he deserve to be killed to make up for all the other murders he's gotten away with over the years? There are no reports of Edgar Watson's ghost being seen around the islands, nor any of his victims, but this is a remote and protected area, so it's not your traditional spooky Florida destination. There could be thousands of ghosts out there, waiting to scare visitors away. But serial killers like Edgar are much more frightening.